Good evening, everyone. Steve Seepersod coming to you from the campus of Binghamton University. And after a pretty long wait, the big night is here. Welcome to Tier Talks, talks that inspire, educate, and resonate. On behalf of the Alumni Association, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. So excited to have you with us. And we have two great alumni speakers who will come to a little bit later on in this program. And this will be a great one. So glad that you are here with us tonight. And Tier Talks is part of our lifelong learning initiatives that are offered by the Alumni Association. And I'll pull up a little graphic on the screen here, as I always do, start out the show with the website address, binghamton.edu/alumni. That's our website here at the Alumni Association. You can learn about all that we offer for you in addition to lifelong learning programs, but I'll talk about the lifelong learning programs now. Things like the Binghamton Learning Network webinar series, Tier Talks. These are meant to feed your lifelong love of learning and provide information on a variety of topics and keep our alumni engaged with the university. After all, education is the reason that you were attracted to Binghamton University, and that does not stop after you graduate, and we are happy to provide these programs to you. So at this time, I'd like to introduce someone who can talk more about the lifelong learning initiatives. So we have Dana West from the class of 1998 joining us from Westchester County, where he lives and works, chair of our lifelong learning committee here at the Alumni Association. Dana, welcome, and thank you so much again for your support of Tier Talks.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks so much. Let me just say that nothing like this can happen without Steve, and your efforts are very appreciated. We got two great speakers, so I'm not going to take more than a second here, but just quick introductions and let you know kind of part of the wider initiative that this is. So I'm, as Steve said, on the board of directors of the Alumni Association. This is my 5th year out of 6, so I'm heading on my way out more than I'm heading in. So we'll be looking at a couple open slots. If any of you are interested in putting your name out there to join the board, happy to have you on that initiative. I'm also the chair of the Lifelong Learning Committee. This is one of many things that we do. From some things that you've probably heard about, we launched our book club during COVID, so we could get together remotely. We have our Tier Talks remotely here. Our featured Tier Talk is at homecoming as always, so I hope you'll join us there. This year it's October 13th through 15th. So mark your calendars and save the date. Hope to see everybody up there on campus. I also happen to lead the Westchester chapter, so we'll be looking for some local events here in the Westchester area. If you're around, look forward to seeing you there as well. What I'd like to say, though, all that being said, we are all the Alumni Association, so whatever it is you choose to do, to join an event, to maybe use this as an inspiration to call an old Binghamton buddy, really whatever it means to you. Joining events is great, but if all you're going to do is be positively minded on Binghamton, that's a win for us too. So really, whatever it is that you see fit. This is our Tier Talks remotely here, so we're going to have a couple of great speakers that I'll have Steve introduce to you in a second. But keep an eye out for other things we have going on. We're launching our travel program for 2024, so just kind of keep your ear to the news of what we have going on out there. So that being said, I'm going to hand it back off to you, Steve, to get this event underway. Thanks again.
Dana, thank you very much for your support, and we certainly appreciate the support of all the alumni board members as well. And as Dana said, we are here for you to keep you connected in whatever way or ways that you find to be most meaningful. And you get to decide what that is. You get to define what your relationship with the university is, and we are the facilitators. We help make that happen. And one more person to recognize, someone else who helps to make Tier Talks happen, is Jen Gabriel, who is behind the scenes with us tonight and is instrumental in helping us put Tier Talks and Binghamton Learning Network webinars together. So certainly would be remiss if we didn't mention Jen as well before proceeding further into tonight's show. So it has been a while since we've had a regionally focused Tier Talk, and certainly alumni everywhere are welcome to be part of the show, but this will have a very, for obvious reasons, New York City concentration of alumni watching, because the content is really geared to this audience. So tonight's program, titled "A Place to Call Home?" A critical look at the New York City housing market. And so if you live in the New York City area, have been there a while, I'm proud to say I'm a native of New York City, although I have ties to a lot of different areas. For me, it's a very special place. There's nowhere else like it in the world. And it's a place where people come from everywhere and they want to be in New York City. And that's part of the dynamic. And certainly As demand goes up, price goes up. And you think about what it was in play prior to COVID and some forces, some dynamics you saw in the market. And COVID comes along and it was almost like hitting the gas pedal on these dynamics. Prices continuing to go up. People push to the outer boroughs into transitioning neighborhoods. Some people deciding maybe a place in New York City is not for me. Because this is just not something I'm able to support any longer. And certainly there's a lot of calls for affordable housing. And that's certainly something very important to make sure the city remains a place for everyone. And so those are the general topics that will be driving what our speakers are going to be talking about tonight. Send us your questions. So we want this to be interactive after we have our two self-contained mini tier talks by each of the speakers. The rest of the time is dedicated to your questions. And so we don't have a necessarily hard stop time, not a hard out time that we have to hit. So we are here for you to answer your questions. Send them in. Start now if you want. I'll put that back up during the show a couple of times here and there. But then also, if you are watching on Facebook, or the microsite, should be a comment box there. Send in the questions in the comment box or by email, and we will get to them. So now bring it to the first speaker, and I'll pull him up here on the screen. He is a member of the class of 2005, was on the Alumni Association board for several years, instrumental in starting the Metro New York chapter of the Alumni Association, which has been very, very successful. His name is Rory Clark, and he is a top agent in the New York City area. And I have like a paragraph full of accolades I could read to talk about your background, but I'll leave it to you to share your expertise and certainly a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience in the market. You were a lawyer for several years and bring that experience with you to help your clients now in the real estate game and have been enormously successful. Rory, thank you so much and welcome to Tier Talk, and we'll toss it to you.
Well, good evening, Steve. Thank you. I appreciate that. A big thank you to Steve for putting this together, and Dana and Jen and all your help and support. I think it's a wonderful program, and I'm honored to be one of the speakers tonight. So hello, fellow alumni. This is a very local and personal topic since we are talking New York City real estate. I've had the good fortune. I was a PPL major at Binghamton, like many pre-law students. I did go to law school, as Steve mentioned. I practiced corporate law here in New York City for 4 years before transitioning. I made a very sharp right turn out of the practice of law into residential real estate sales, which I've now been doing since about 2012 with the same company, Brown Harris Stevens here in New York City. So I feel very fortunate to do that for a living. And I just want to start with an interesting fact. 2019, the New York City residential real estate market was humming along. Pricing had come down a little bit from a very heated market from about 2013 to 2017. And we had about 23,000 transactions across New York City in 2019. That's before any of us really knew the commonplace definition of the word pandemic. 2020, we went to 17,000 transactions. 2021, 2022, we had 31,000 transactions 2 years in a row. And that was the first time we ascended 31,000 transactions going back to 2007, the last crisis. So if anyone asks you if New York City did come back, I can tell you it came back more and quicker than people thought. But I'd love to talk tonight about sort of how we got there, where we are today, and maybe a few things that could be helpful to alumni sort of living in the city, navigating things, whether you're thinking about buying, renting, or just curious about real estate. People love to talk real estate. So, you know, I really felt selling real estate for a living in New York City here, we were really on ground zero when we reopened back in June of 2020. Real estate was not considered essential, so we reopened in stage 2. And essentially New York, after having come down and pricing a little bit into 19, as I said, we had to recreate a whole world. And it was a scary world as transactions literally stopped, which in my world does not happen. The phone is constantly ringing, but the phone started to stop ringing from about March to June of 2020. And so in June of 2020, when we reopened, everyone said, well, what are things worth now? Do people want to be here? Do I want to be here? And it was a scary, interesting time to be here. And in residential real estate, it was sort of a bird's eye view of what was happening in the city and where things were. And I can tell you the market found its place. Pricing dropped anywhere from 3 to 10% back in summer of 2020 as buyers were very hesitantly jumping in. And looking back, it's easy to say now, but it really is true. And I'm a 2005 graduate, and I think everyone needs to heed this advice, that the time to buy is when everyone else is running, and vice versa. Because the folks that did jump in the summer and fall of 2020 got really, really advantageous pricing. And all of a sudden, I woke up in January of 2021, and we were seeing bidding wars again. And at that point, buyers got more comfortable with where the world was. The pandemic was moving on. It was certainly not done, but people were trying to figure out and learning how to live with it. And we saw New York City was adapting with it. And so New York is still evolving and adapting. There are certainly issues and new issues and things that are ongoing issues that need to be resolved and addressed, both by many of the stakeholders, not just the mayor and the governor and all the local politicians and stakeholders, public and private. There are ongoing things. But what I can tell you is people do want to be here. Not everyone. Many people have left. But not everyone has left because, like I said, we had 31,000 transactions for 2 years in a row. And so people ask me, well, why would someone buy in New York City? And the first thing is asset preservation. New York City, amongst a handful of other cities across the globe, we call it Singapore, London, Hong Kong, potentially Miami now, potentially LA. People are looking to park money and preserve their asset. They're not necessarily even worried about growing that asset. They're not as concerned about income off of that asset, but preserving the asset. And yes, New York City has swung up and down, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the asset over time has, generally speaking, always gone up and higher than it ever has. At the moment, we're not at peak pricing. We're actually not far off. The median pricing, which is over $1 million, is sort of a hair or two below where we were about a year or two ago when we did reach about another median peak. And so there still is advantageous pricing out in the marketplace right now, both for buyers that are looking to jump in and get a deal. But I will say that there are bidding wars happening. There are buyers that are jumping in, and interest rates have reached a point where many buyers are comfortable that this is the new environment of where we are. Interest rates are no longer 3%. Those days are currently over, but people need a place to live. And so if you want to be in New York City, are you going to rent? Are you going to buy? Or maybe this isn't the place for you, and that's also okay. Everyone has a place to be, and that's totally comfortable with everyone. So where we are today, pricing, like I mentioned earlier, January of 21, we started to see bidding wars all of a sudden, and pricing really jumped back up, and sellers were very excited. Sellers are coming back to the margins. And we had that until about the summer of 21, where things then took another bit of a breather. Things were still healthy, but things took a breather. And then in 2022, as the talk of the Fed raising interest rates started to come into focus, we saw another crescendo of massive interest from buyers from January till about April, May of 2022, where there was just incredible interest in bidding wars. And of course, not every property, but across the city, there was incredible interest. And people wanted to jump in and lock in an interest rate before they really meaningfully took a rise and impacted people's purchasing power. And of course, that has happened. Since June of 2022, where we've seen rates really meaningfully go up, we have seen transaction volume come down considerably. And naturally, of course, as demand came down, we've seen pricing ease up as well. Now, that went on until about, I'd say, end of December. And since Q1 of 2023, we're seeing this new normal now. We're in a very healthy marketplace. Buyers and sellers are transacting, not everyone. Some sellers are having a hard time understanding that in some cases, pricing is down from 6 to 12 months ago. And in other cases, buyers are looking to get a quote unquote deal. And I just want to add to that, it's very rarely I've been in a closing of my 13-year career where the buyer or seller is dancing away, that they sort of tricked the other party. You know, I think the art of a negotiation is that both parties did feel like they gave in a little bit. And generally speaking, that's what happens when you walk away from a closing table. But you want to make sure that you're getting the fair market value if you're a buyer or a seller. And in order to do that, you typically want to hire a real estate professional that can guide you through the process. In New York, like every marketplace has its own nuances. And so it's important to sort of have that insight and intel to understand where that is. On the rental side, we're pretty much at near median highs. I think the March rental pricing could pretty much crescendo to an all-time rental high. And I have some clients that call me and they joke. They say, I thought people left. And I said, well, The rental market has not imploded. It's actually quite strong as well. And people want to be in New York City. Now, why they want to be there? A lot of people are not necessarily working 5 days a week in the office, but they're in 2 to 3 days a week in the office and they want to be close by. It's not just about work for a lot of people. People want the lifestyle, whether it's Manhattan or Brooklyn. And Steve sort of alluded in the introduction to how neighborhood dynamics have changed, particularly with COVID and remote work. What I'm seeing on a personal level is I think location is mattering less to buyers and renters versus the apartment itself, the building itself, because people are not commuting as often and they don't need to be in the office and need to be by a train stop. And so I think that's opened things up for a lot of people in different neighborhoods. And so that's spread things out a little bit. I think it's given people a little bit more opportunity. And I think that's generally speaking a good thing. As far as office flow on the commercial side, we're hearing we're about 60 to 65% of occupancy on the commercial level. Could that be concerning? I think that's something that a lot of people are looking very closely at. Finally, we're seeing on the public side that there's an interest in trying to help a potential commercial to residential conversion. Now, it's important to know that, is that going to be financially feasible for every individual commercial owner? And that's an important question. It's easier said than done. The mayor, has made some comments about that and potentially changing zoning laws as far as windows and things like that to accommodate these commercial buildings becoming residential buildings. And I think it's important that everyone thinks hard about it. I think it's an important thing to put out there. I think a lot of commercial buildings will need to adapt and stay competitive. And the question is, how do they do that in a free market economy, right? There's got to be money to do that. The financial district is a great example where there was a public-private partnership, a lot of public incentives for a lot of those grand old commercial buildings that were no longer being used the way they were to then convert to residential condominiums. And you have a many host of beautiful, full amenity residential buildings down the financial district that have done very well over the years. There's one going on right now at 1 Wall Street by Harry Macau, a very eponymous developer. So there's still interest down there. And so the financial district is a good example of a neighborhood that was able to sort of adapt and use the commercial to residential conversion as an effective tool. Whether that can be done in other neighborhoods such as Midtown, where we're seeing commercial buildings that are a little bit older, and there's something called the Midtown East rezoning proposal, which has been ongoing for years now. That's part of One Vanderbilt, the large building next to Grand Central, which is allowing buildings to sort of go beyond traditional zoning laws in order to rezone and potentially add on to be competitive with a lot of the new commercial buildings that are in the city. And then some that are now, like I've mentioned, looking in to converting to a residential component. So it's important. Housing is a fundamental need from everybody. And so we need to be thinking forward about how to resolve these things for everybody. And every stakeholder has a different interest, whether it's a developer, a purchaser, a renter, somebody who doesn't have access to housing. And I think New York City likes to think of itself as at the forefront of trying to create these policies. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the second component of it. And I think that's an important piece of this. I just want to throw out a couple things, calls that I get all the time that people sort of have questions. They want to potentially buy in New York City and they don't really know where to start, what to do, what things to think about. So I think it's important to sort of break things down into a few different worlds. One being, what am I going to buy? New York City is broken down into a few different housing stock ownerships. We have condominiums, we have cooperatives, we have townhouses, and then we have rental buildings, which are obviously outside of that scope if you're looking to purchase a property. Not to confuse everyone, but we also have something called condops. Condop is legally a co-op, but it operates like a condo. So we have primarily condos, co-ops, and townhouses. Your budget is typically going to be the best way to sort of work backwards and at least narrow this conversation down to figure out where you're going to be. A co-op, where you don't own title to a deed, but you actually own stock and stock in a corporation, as well as a master proprietary lease, that's going to typically be the biggest bang for your buck. And so most people will go the co-op route to get a little bit more space. And there are some benefits to co-ops. Co-ops have significantly less closing costs than condos and townhouses. So that's another nice benefit of a co-op. A condominium works well for people that are not looking to go into a restrictive environment, as far as the ability to rent out the apartment, the ability to having to get approved to purchase the apartment or to sublet the apartment, things like flip taxes and sublet fees. Those are typically all of nature in a co-op and not a condo. So a condo being a more sort of free alienability property where you do get title to a deed, a typical condo will trade anywhere from 12 to 20% more than the same sized co-op. And that's just, again, investors, foreign purchasers, anyone can potentially buy a condo, whereas a co-op has a lot more limited feel. Townhouse, of course, is going to be budget driven as well. There's really no restrictions because it's like buying a freestanding house. But of course, it's a bit of a different price point typically to buy in a townhouse. So I think it's important to think about that up front as a threshold of what type of property you want to buy, what your budget is, and then what's important within that property. Then you can kind of work backwards into neighborhoods and other smaller things like amenities and things like that that are important to you in a building. So hopefully that's helpful as an initial buyer. Renters also always curious. Renting in New York City is a bit of like the wild, wild west, I always say. And so you got to know what questions to ask, and you certainly want to be careful as you start that search. So, New York City, there's always a lot of talks about broker fees and how to start the search. So a lot of things are online these days, as we all know. Broker fees can be frustrating for many tenants, but they are a fact of typically renting. And so I think it's important when you're starting your search to understand, as you reach out to brokers, to understand, is there a broker fee on a property? How will that impact me? Are there any other application fees? When does the lease start? Things like that. And I know a lot of folks also are going to look for roommates, particularly our newest graduates. Congratulations to the class of 23. There's many great websites and apps these days. The Tinders for roommates, there's plenty of them out there actually, where you could potentially find a roommate, where you can potentially get into a larger apartment, maybe a better building if you can take on a roommate or two and get a one bedroom converted to a two bedroom or a two bedroom converted to a three bedroom to sort of fit your needs. So I'm happy to say, it's been a wild ride since March 2020, and working in real estate during this time, it's been fulfilling actually to really help clients navigate this landmine. And to this day, it's still a challenge for many people buying, selling, and renting, figuring out the marketplace, finding whether it's a bidding war, finding the right place, the right price for something. And so New York City, like I mentioned, there are issues going on, no doubt. But what I would tell you by and large is pricing right now is being driven by macro trends and inventory. And on the sell side, we actually still have a little bit limited good inventory. And that means well-priced, good apartments. There's a bit of a shortage of that. And that's driving pricing. On the rental side, inventory is also certainly driving pricing and competition. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I know we want to keep our program to a tight time frame. I'd love to welcome questions after the second component.
Rory, thank you so much. And certainly a lot of great information that you shared in a short amount of time. And we're starting to get some questions, and I can assure you we will get to those questions following the next presentation and be here as long as necessary to get everybody's questions answered. So thank you very much, Rory. We'll see you in about 15, 20 minutes or so. And now on to our next presenter, and he is a Binghamton alum who has spent the majority of his career in public service and in government and nonprofits, looking at the public policy and advocacy side of the issues that we are talking about today with respect to the New York City housing market. And I'm pleased to bring in Joe Jones from the class of 2007. He is the Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Research at the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, which is FPWA for short. It oversees the research and policy agenda promoting poverty alleviation and reducing systemic barriers to economic deprivation. A lot of stuff I don't normally like to read, but I didn't want to mess that up, and I'll leave it to you to tell us more about your background and dive right into your presentation. Joe, thank you so much. Great to have you on the Tier Talk.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to the Alumni Association, Dana, everyone. Thanks to my fellow presenter, Rory. And then also I want to give a special thanks to the FPWA team who were instrumental in helping put this presentation together, which I will show in a few minutes, Brad and Julia. Just a little bit about my background. I am, as Steve mentioned, an '07 graduate. I too went to law school after graduating, University of Michigan, and after graduating from there, I did a joint degree in housing as well. Housing policy and urban policy, as well as my law degree. Graduated and started working in sort of the housing policy space. Primarily, I've worked for governments, but I've decided to take a new stroll into the wild world of the sort of advocacy, public policy, nonprofit space, um, which I will tell you, for those of you who don't know, when people ask what I do for work, I say I am a lobbyist for low-income New Yorkers. So if you're sort of wondering what that looks like, that's kind of what that looks like. And I am going to try to figure out how to share my computer and share my presentation. Give me one moment. There we go. All right. Uh, you would think after so many years of doing remote work, we would have kind of figured this out. All right, there we go. Okay, awesome. Here we are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of low-income housing for New Yorkers in crisis. And you'll see the subheading is the crisis in New York City. For many of the factors that Rory mentioned earlier, particularly the low supply, if you think it's tough for folks who are renting at the sort of middle income or upper income groups, it's even worse for folks renting at the low income. I'm going to introduce you to Mary. Mary is a hypothetical person that we made up for the slide. There is no Mary in real life, except there is a Mary, right? Everyone is kind of a Mary. Mary just got a new job at the lovely firm of FPW&A as a paralegal, making about $70,000 a year. Mary has 2 kids, and Mary is really excited about her new job. It's a lot more than she was making before, and she's deciding that she wants to move into New York City because of her work. She wants to be close to the action, close to the office. Even though she may be on a hybrid schedule, she still needs to be in the office, and being in the city is the most efficient way of doing that, particularly because maybe she has family here who can help provide with childcare because she has 2 kids. However, New York City is exceptionally expensive. You'll see that compared to the national average, housing, which obviously is what we're here to talk about, is about 230% higher here in New York City. But that's just housing. Other things are also more expensive. I want to highlight food, which became a really big issue during the pandemic with all of the food shortages, which itself is about 25% higher than the national average. Goods and services, things like getting your hair cut, getting new pair of shoes, getting clothes for your kids. Those costs are also about 28% higher, and that also includes costs like, oh, I don't know, childcare, like if you have 2 small children, like Mary does. So these are some of the really things that we're seeing folks are being squeezed at. A report just came out, produced by the United Way for New York City and the Fund for the City of New York, which highlighted that about 50%, that's half of all New Yorkers, are struggling to cover things like basic needs, forcing them to make choices between things like whether they're going to pay their rent this month or whether they're going to pay their childcare expenses, whether they're going to get that medical appointment and get that procedure done, or whether they're going to be able to buy food to feed their families. So affordability in the city is at an all-time low, and the crisis is at an all-time high. Switch just to quickly talk about rent in general. So rent for New Yorkers, about 42% of New Yorkers are rent burdened, which means that they're paying more than 30% of their income. And 23% of those folks are severely rent burdened, meaning that they're paying over half of their income in just housing costs alone. Part of the reason why we see these exorbitant rents, and I just highlighted sort of the median rent for 2 bedrooms across the 5 boroughs, ranging from the cheapest in Staten Island at $2,300 a month to the most expensive in Manhattan at almost $4,500 a month. And I just gave you a quick estimate if you were not to be rent burdened, how much money you would need to make. And as you see, folks like Mary, who's making $70,000, which would not classify her as poor, particularly not by the sort of inadequate and woefully immoral federal poverty level that we have set. Really, she would be classified as middle income. Sometimes, depending on where you're looking at, she could be classified as the sort of quote unquote middle class. But as you can see, she would not be able to rent a 2 bedroom for her and her kids anywhere in the city without taking out or without paying significantly more than she earns in her income. So moving on, part of the reason why we see these sorts of issues is because the supply of housing in New York City is at an all-time low. Part of that is because it's really expensive to build housing in New York City, particularly affordable housing, where the development costs are going to not necessarily be subsidized and can't be directly passed on to future tenants or owners. So just some quick highlights, right? About 800, it costs about $800,000 to construct one single new unit of affordable housing. And that's the total cost, including operating costs, etc. However, if you were just to look at construction cost alone for a hypothetical, say, 800 square foot 2 bedroom unit in a 100 unit building, you would need between $31,000 and $60,000 a year in rent just to make up for the construction costs. And again, I'm not talking about operation costs, I'm not talking about maintenance costs, and I'm not talking about any sort of incentives to developers, including profit. So that means that even in the least expensive markets, which are parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn, you would need about $2,600 a month in order to charge rents about $2,600 a month in order to subsidize just the construction cost alone. And again, like I said, this leaves nothing for maintenance or profit. Which is why you see the affordable housing development in New York City being so concentrated. There are other reasons for that, including NIMBYism, which I'll talk a little bit about later in relation to some other slides. But you see affordable housing being concentrated severely in the South Bronx, certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and certain parts of Western Queens or Southwestern Queens. Move on. So these are all sorts of what we call market failures. It's the reason why I do the work that I do is because the market fails frequently, it fails often, and it requires the government to intervene. A lot of people, I was a poli-sci major, but I had a minor in econ, and I often hear, "Oh, if the government just got out of the way, the market would correct itself." Yeah, we've seen time and time again that does not work. The government getting out of the way actually just leads to lots of people being deeply impoverished as well as exploited. So I think that there's always a room for both the market and for the government to work in tandem to find solutions to folks' problems that they're experiencing. So, speaking of solutions, yeah, our friend Mary, she was really excited to hear about the New York State Housing Compact, which you may also have heard of as part of the New York State budget deals. It included some of those things that Rory was talking about earlier, such as including the conversion of commercial properties to residential properties, but they included other things, including statewide housing targets, including affordable housing targets, incentives for developing new housing around transit, as well as a potential to the 421A tax development program, which I'll talk about a little bit in further detail later, and just a general mixed bag to increase both housing production as well as the supply of affordable housing in New York State. However, as many things happen in politics and policy, the housing compact did not pass. It was killed by a number of reasons. One of which, and we'll talk a little bit again about this later, is there was rabid opposition to it in some of the suburban counties surrounding New York City. I mean, and as well as parts of New York City itself. There was just a general lack of enthusiasm for some of the proposals. I'll go through a little bit of what sorts of interventions, not exclusive to the housing compact, but sort of general interventions that the government can take in terms of supporting both the regulation of prices as well as the development of affordable housing in the city. So the four that I'm going to talk about are rent regulations, providing incentives to increase supply of affordable housing, protections for tenants in properties to make sure that the rents stay affordable, and as well as what we call income supports, or the sort of things that people tend to think of when they think of government interventions into the housing market. So let's start with rent regulation. Most people know this as rent control, but really rent regulation is actually the better term for it, because rent control only covers a small portion of the units that are regulated in the city. About 16,000 and a half units are covered, compared to those which are rent stabilized, which is a much broader categorization of rent regulation, which is not quite as strict or quite as invasive as rent control, and that covers well over 1 million units. And people think that just if you look into a rent stabilized or rent controlled unit, which again, even in a city as large as New York and with numbers as large as 1 million for the rent stabilized apartments, it's still a fairly small portion of, it's about 40-ish% of the state's or of the city's housing supply is regulated. So that leaves about 60 something percent that it remains unregulated. People tend to think that that means that, oh, you're not paying rent. But in fact, these are folks do have increases. In fact, the Rent Guidelines Board, which regulates the development and the cost of the rent stabilized units, just voted a couple of weeks ago to increase rents between 2 and 5% on 1 year leases, and between 5 and 7% on 2 year leases. Uh, Also important to know that rent regulation is really not a thing that happens in some of the incentive development programs. There is still a sort of like push to increase and move new units of developed housing into rent regulated status. But for the vast majority of rent regulated buildings, they need to have been built before 1971. So while it still does control a significant portion of the New York housing housing market, it does not actually impact newly developed construction to the same extent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about things to increase supply. One of the most important things to note about increased supply, and Rory touched on this earlier, is that there is a certain level of supply that needs to increase as populations grow. As the New York State population grows, kids get older, they need to get their own houses. People have families, they need their own houses. So there's a certain level of development that needs to happen just in order to maintain the sort of natural flow of population. There needs to be new and greater housing built. However, one of the things that happened is New York had a really decent economy between 2010 and 2020. In that 10-year period, it added about 1.2 million jobs. 1 million of those alone were in New York City. It added about 800,000 new residents, about 600,000 of whom were in New York City. And here's the problem. It only added about 400,000 new units of affordable housing, or new units of housing, period, not just affordable housing, which about half of which were in New York City. So when you take into account the increase in jobs, the increase in residents, and the sort of natural growth and aging of the population, not to mention new migration patterns, you start to see why we're in such a dire straits as we're in when it comes to the supply of housing. Um, and New York just is not really keeping pace with its peer cities. So if you look at here, you'll see New York is fourth to the bottom of this list of cities in terms of increasing new housing. It's built about 27 new housing units for every 100,000, or for every 10,000. Sorry, 1,000. my number's correct, 1,000 residents. Compare that to a city like Austin, which you often hear being cited as a fastly growing metropolitan, which has added about 117 new units, or a place like, say, Atlanta, which has added around 89 new units of housing. Um, and that housing has not really been distributed evenly. So I've mentioned earlier about NIMBYs, or not in my backyard people who just don't want new housing, new, whether it's affordable or not affordable. They kind of enjoy the neighborhood quality that they have. They don't want increased density. They don't want more folks coming into their communities, and we see a lot of that, right? The sort of lower Hudson region, Westchester and Rockland counties, as well as Long Island, Nassau and Suffolk County, have, as a proportion, added the least amount of new units of housing compared to some of its peer cities. If you look at the inner suburbs of Virginia or Maryland around Washington, D.C., or even the inner suburbs of New Jersey here in New York City, which is actually where I call home, you'll see that these places have just done a much better job. New York City itself has tried to increase its housing production, but again, as I mentioned earlier, building in New York is exceptionally expensive, for a variety of reasons, including land costs, which is extremely high, much, much higher than it is in the suburban counties that surround it. So you run into these issues where New York, even though it's tried to produce more housing, really needs the cooperation of its surrounding counties and surrounding municipalities, in order to increase the supply of housing, in order to really kind of regulate what the affordability crisis is doing. One of the other ways of increasing supply is to provide incentives to developers, to build new units of housing. One of the most prevalent, which you may have heard of, it was a big deal in the sort of news of around last year, was the 421A program, which did a lot of things, but on premise, it provided 100% tax break to the development, where about between 20 and 30% of the units were allocated to be affordable. Um, One of the things that's important to note is that there are different degrees of affordability, and different price levels, based off of the degrees of affordability. The steepest degree of affordability would have been 30% of the area median income. Um, and up in the 421A program, you could have gone as far as 130% of the area median income. So if the area median income was $100,000, for example, you could have priced affordable units to folks as high as $130,000, or as low as $30,000. Given where we know the market is and where the need is, which is the deeply affordable units, it may be surprising to no one, or at least it was surprising to me to learn that from 2014 until the program expired the last year, only 40, not 44,000, not 4,400, actually 44 units of housing were built at that deeply affordable level. The vast majority of the housing was built, obviously, at the 130,000 AMI level, which approximately for New York City as a whole, not looking at specific neighborhood characteristics, was about $156,000 a year. Um, our friend Marriott, who makes $70,000, which is actually not a terrible salary, all things considered, is still only about 60% AMI, which again would not have qualified her for any of the housing that actually was built. The other thing to note about most of the affordable housing that was built under 421A was the vast majority of it was one bedrooms or studios, built for couples or single people. And our friend Mary, with her two children, who probably needed a two-bedroom unit, at least while the kids were younger, and potentially maybe a three-bedroom, depending whether or not the kids were of the same gender, or whether she wanted her kids to stay in the same unit together. Um, may have needed a 3-bedroom, and there just were not very many of those built. So the supply, again, exceptionally low. 421A was allowed to expire last year, primarily, I think, driven because of its general failures as producing deeply affordable housing, as well as really sort of any sort of affordable housing when you're thinking about even producing housing for folks making $70,000, $80,000 a year. Um, but there hasn't been a renewed program. It was part of the housing compact, which we talked about earlier, not passing. And so, it remains to be seen what sort of incentives the states come up with in order to increase the supply of housing and incentivize developers to potentially build more of this housing, which, as I mentioned, is exceptionally expensive. So moving on to sort of another bucket of things, which is tenant protections. So, assume our friend Mary is lucky enough to find a unit of housing, which she may or may not have. There were some tenant protections, and I will say that this is potentially an area where there was a little bit of positive news for low-income New Yorkers. In 2019, the state passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which was a new law sort of regulating both market rate and rent regulated housing. And it made a number of changes. I listed a few of them there. It capped security deposit, it limited fees that developers could charge, it removed things like the tenant blacklist, which would prevent people from renting apartments if they had ever been evicted from a previous apartment in the past. Speaking of evictions, it provided additional protections to tenants in eviction proceedings, some procedural, some substantive. And it really generally just made it easier to negotiate with your landlord, specifically around things like getting your security deposit back. There's still some work to be done there. I think what I call the sort of next frontier of tenant protections is something called good cause eviction. And good cause eviction basically, with the exception of non-payment of rent, it removes many of the landlord's grounds for evicting tenants. Um, there can be a whole 40-minute, 50-minute, hour-long conversation that we have about the pros and cons of good cause eviction. I will say, at least on one of the pro sides, is it does minimize some of what we have seen in the past, which is sort of tenants being evicted for discriminatory purposes without saying it's discrimination. So, for example, it is illegal to not rent to a tenant on the basis of their family status, for the example of having children. However, it is not illegal, or it is also illegal to evict someone because they have children. However, it is not illegal to evict someone because they're, quote, too noisy, or because you hear them like running up and down the halls as, small children do. Um, Good cause eviction does at least provide some possibility of limiting those sorts of discriminatory practices that are much harder to seek in the actual day-to-day existence of tenants. However, we know that from a sort of global and systemic point of view, they happen all the time. And so that is at least one thing to speak in favor of good cause eviction. And again, like I said, there are many others which we can discuss at another time. And then last and the most common sort of way that the government interferes and sort of or regulates the marketplace is through income supports. And I think this is the one that most people most commonly think of as a government intervention, which is kind of why I saved it for the end. And this really, I think the most common one that folks know is Section 8, which is a voucher program administered by the federal government through states and localities, which provides funding for people to pay their rent. um, I will point out that the Section 8 wait time in New York, depending on what entity you get it from in New York City, is between 23 months and 30 months, so somewhere between 2 and 3 years before you are even eligible to get a voucher. And then once you get the voucher, you still have to deal with actually finding a unit that will allow you to take the voucher. We see all of the time source of income discrimination, which is discrimination on the basis of where the money comes from, such as like a voucher payment. This is something that both the city and the state are taking a very serious look at how we can regulate to ensure and prevent this from happening, so that these vouchers that are being issued are actually being able to be used by tenants who are looking for housing. Other ones worth mentioning is the City FEPS program, which is a city level program. However, at the moment, it primarily only serves current shelter residents or shelter residents who have a high risk of, or people who have a high risk of shelter entry. And that doesn't really serve folks like Mary, who is not homeless currently, and probably, depending on what her current housing situation is, may not actually be at high risk for becoming homeless. So she's probably ineligible for a program like this. The HAVP program, or the Housing Access Voucher Program, is a state level program which has not yet been signed into law. It was part of the negotiations around the state's budget, which just passed a few weeks ago. It did not make it into the budget cycle this year, but it would operate a state level program of voucher services, which are very similar to the Section 8 voucher program. But again, doesn't quite exist. And again, it is also intended primarily for folks who are either homeless or at immediate eviction of or at immediate risk of eviction, which we know that Mary in her current situation is not. And so I think that's one of those things for us to think about when we're talking about this work is what happens to people like Mary? What happens to people who are seeking housing and who are not yet housed? And how do the government interventions also support them? So, I think in conclusion, we're not really sure what the future holds. We're not sure what the future holds for Mary. We're not sure what the future holds for the state of New York City housing for low-income tenants. I think that there is a lot of potential, but the affordability crisis is real, and it's really trickling up the income structure. People think of it as people making $30,000 a year, not people making $80,000 a year. But as I mentioned earlier, half of New Yorkers. So that's everyone from folks making $100,000 a year to people making $200,000 a year to people making $10,000 a year, are having struggling to pay their bills, struggling to make ends meet. And so I think it's really important for us to consider sort of generally the affordability in New York City. And yeah, I turn it back over to Steve. Thanks, everyone.
Joe, thanks very much. And thinking through potential titles for this program, one of the titles that I thought about and we went with the thing that we went with was where do we go from here? And as I see the two people featured in your last slide, and they were the characters in the story, those all through your presentation. It's like, where do they go from here? We don't know. It's that's the scary part, and it's shocking to think about. We hear about inflation all the time and think about having to make choices. I'm going to do this. I'm going to wait on doing something else, or I'm going to do both things at the same time. It's going to be really tough to see those figures on that slide early in the presentation, showing how much things have gone up relative to the state as a whole. But also to the rest of the country is quite shocking, and it's disproportionate the impact that has had on people living in the city compared to anywhere else. And so thank you for a very informative presentation. So at this point, we'll bring in Rory, and we did get some questions, and I'll throw these out, and some of them may be obvious as to who they're directed at based on what specifically was asked. But the first one would be from Elizabeth, who asks, how about short-term rentals and month by month? Where in the city would you be able to find those? Sounds like a Rory question, but either one of you or both can take it.
Yeah, I think that's a very specific question. There are a couple of websites that focus on short-term rentals. One called leasebreak.com is a popular one. And I do have a guide for that as well. So I'd be happy to help with offline if someone wants different resources where you can find short-term rentals, because those are even bigger wild west within the wild west. But there are definitely a lot of resources out there for that.
Great. And one question that came in, well, this is my question. I get to first, and then I get some of the others, just to be totally honest about the source of it. And, this came from looking at the slide Joe had about the comparisons to other cities. And so we saw Austin and some of the others. And I guess maybe it's a question for either one, just to ask, how much is all of this made worse by just the lack of ability that you have in New York City to build outward? You can't build outward as much as you can build up. And I think about, you had Austin on the slide. It made me think of Columbus, Ohio, which I'm very familiar with, a city that's grown by 50% in the last 30 years, largely through annexations and any property that was part of a suburban township that they could build subdivisions on got annexed into the city, so much so that it spread even into its neighboring counties, and there's built and built and built and built. And as prices have a way of doing, they went up, but not in a way that was out of this world. And it's a very different dynamic than New York City. But the sense of being landlocked, how much does that really impact what we're seeing?
Yeah, I welcome Rory's thoughts on this too. I think it does impact it, and it's part of why I think it's important to think about what can our surrounding municipalities really do to help, right? Like New York doesn't have the same sort of rules around annexation. Like, New York can't just annex Westchester County, as much as I think in some respects it may love to sometimes. It can't annex Rockland or Hudson or Putnam. I think that there are sorts of these like municipalities. I mean, I think the similar issues apply with the fact that New York City is not just landlocked, but it's also landlocked and surrounded by other states, right? The New York metro area spans 4 different states who don't often coordinate with one another, specifically not at the state level and certainly not at the local level to inform housing policy in the same way. And so I think that there's always this tension and these dynamics between what can we do unilaterally and what can we do in conjunction and in partnership with with our surrounding townships, municipalities, locations. But I also think it's important, and I'll let Rory talk after this, to remember that New York is big, right? Like New York is about 302 square miles, give or take. It's not all developed, right? Like there's like parts of New York that can still take new housing. It's maybe not greenfield anymore, but there's still potential for new housing growth within the city itself. And I think there's a sort of mindset that we all need to get into the sort of habit of saying like, yes, more housing, yes, more housing, yes, more housing. Even if it changes a little bit of the like cute quality of the Carrow Gardens and the Cobble Hills, which I love and adore, but there's still more room for our fellow New Yorkers, and I think it's really important to remember that as we sort of move forward.
Well, I'll just add in, no doubt about it. The old adage is, buy land because they're not making any more of it. And we live in a vertical city for sure. And with that, it has its own host of issues, right? You can't just build on top of a building, right? We have such a complicated zoning system as it is, and then a landmark system on top of that. And Joe has pointed out a lot of the issues with the public-private matching of the worlds. If you want someone to build a new building and you want to provide some affordable housing component to it, as well as a free market component to it, it's got to make sense for the person building it as well. And so that's where the government would have to come into play. And that's an ongoing conversation that a lot of smart people are working on, and it's a complicated issue.
And so, Joe, you had an interesting descriptor there on talking about the metro area. So for years, those of us who are long-timers to the area had heard it as the tri-state area, and you describe it as being 4 states, with the 4th state now being Pennsylvania. And so around the time that I moved back to Binghamton, and I think both of you were probably students here at Binghamton at the time, it was starting that marketing pitch to build houses in the Stroudsburg area in the Poconos, and we saw the commercials on New York City television for why rent, and it was drawing a lot of unsuspecting people to buy homes in the Poconos. And they were given some misleading information on how short the commute time would be, and we know it's tremendous compared to coming in from other locations. And then there were a lot of foreclosures, and people found that lifestyle to be untenable, to try to be that far away from the city and work 5 days a week. And so that it calmed down, but still a lot of people doing that mega commute. Are we seeing trends where that's picking up more, as it's for some people that necessity is no longer there to be having to go into the office 5 days or maybe even at all?
Rory, I'll turn over.
Well, yeah, look, I know very few people are in the office 5 days a week. So that has changed the whole dynamic of living. We have a lot of clients that own, more than one property, and they're no longer calling one a primary and one a vacation home. Things are a lot more fluid now. Maybe they're spending 2 or 3 days a week, wherever it is, whether it's upstate, the Berkshires, the Hamptons, Europe. And not everyone has a gazillion dollars, but a lot of people have the means to have a second home, and then they're in the city for 2 or 3 days a week. They're working in the office, and then they're in their other home for a few days a week. So I think that that's changed not just the dynamic in New York City, but you've seen the suburban market, which is not the focus of today, but we have plenty of Binghamton alumni in the metro New York area, and the suburbs are on fire. People can't buy a house. The inventory is so tight, and people are so comfortable leaving the city that want the space, because they can do it, and they can work from home just like we can have a TED Talk, all from our offices at home.
And so, Rory, you mentioned earlier in your presentation about why buy in New York City, and for a lot of people, it's seen as a place to park money, and it's seen as a very safe investment for that reason. What percentage of the people you work with are people outside the area? I'm going to guess you're probably working more with people already internal to the New York City market, but I'm kind of curious what that balance looks like for you.
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't have a percentage on that, but what I will say is my clientele, and I think across the city, we're seeing a lot of the same trends, is that since the pandemic, a lot of the interest in purchasing in New York City has come locally. It's been from domestic and local folks who are, whether it's trading up, trading down, moving in, some left and rented and came back, a lot more so than the foreign investor or foreign purchaser. Not to say that it doesn't exist. I have a few clients that have bought property in New York City and still haven't even visited the property. So you still do have that, and that's, they still want to have that New York City apartment and that presence. But we are seeing a nice drive from locally sourced buyers.
Great. And we're coming up on 7:30 or a little bit past, so we'll take one more question and then we'll just go into the wrap up mode. And again, this one could be for either, maybe for Rory. Can a new buyer in the city still expect their property value to increase predictably?
Well, we always say in our industry, we're not in the prediction business. But what I will say, I'll say two things. One, I wouldn't do what I do for a living if I didn't believe in New York City long term. I just wouldn't feel comfortable doing it. I always tell every buyer the moment I meet them, if they want to purchase property, that they should expect to hold that property for at least 3 to 5 years. Otherwise, there's a lot of downside. There's a lot of downside there if you catch the market at the wrong time. So I think you have to have a midterm outlook to do well in New York City real estate. And I think if you do that, generally speaking, people always do very nicely. The last few years have proven to be much more volatile than we've seen, and I think that may continue. But I think long term, the statistics show, people are still buying. We're in a very healthy market, and long term, that makes me feel good about my clients buying in New York City.
Well, as always, it was a fast hour. And Joe, Rory, thank you again very much for spending time with us here in the evening after, I'm sure, what has been a very busy workday, to share your expertise with those who are in the Binghamton Alumni Network. And that's one of the best things I think about the Alumni Association is our alumni have so much great expertise, but they're also incredibly generous, and they're willing to share it with others who are part of the Binghamton family. So thank you both for being part of the program today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I do it what I do for those people who aren't able to listen to this, who aren't at this table. And so thanks for the opportunity to highlight them and spotlight them and being part of this great panel.
Great. And so before we wrap up, just want to promote one program that we have coming up on June 14th. This is a webinar as part of the Binghamton Learning Network webinar series. It's titled Hit the Ground Running. Our featured speaker is going to be Alan Stein from the class of 1995, and he's going to talk about information that's very helpful to somebody starting a new position, how to build a strong relationship with your manager or management team, and position yourself for a promotion, to be really, really forward thinking. Even though you're new on the job, everything counts from the second you're there. And the presentation will be intended to help those who are going to be starting a new job or new in a role and want to position themselves to be in the best position to move up. So join us. That's going to be on June 14th at 12 o'clock. So back in our familiar noontime slot, part of the Binghamton Learning Network series, and registration should be open for that. And we have some emails that are going to be going out soon to all of our alumni that describe all of the events and programs that we offer. And so the registration link will be contained within that. So sign up for that. Sign up for a live in-person program if we are offering one in your area. We certainly love to meet alumni, whether it's in person or virtually. And as I said at the start of the program, what we offer is meant to fill the needs that you have to move up in your career or to have personally enriching programs. And let us know what it is that you want. Don't be shy, because we are here for you. So that's now the time to wrap it up for this tier talk, and certainly very appreciative that you've joined us this evening. So for Rory, Joe, Dana, and Jen, I'm Steve C. Prasad. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time on the Binghamton Learning